Welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Coelho, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and global healing. We do this through online interviews and presentations by guest speakers, classes, and study groups. And we draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading edge studies in science, consciousness, spirituality, and philosophy. We've been doing this for the past 18 years. In 2019, we began recording our presentations. And so now we have, I think a little more than 80 on our YouTube channel. And our video recordings are viewable. The channel is Caritas Consciousness Project. And when you open that in YouTube, you have to then click on the name to get all of our videos lined up for you. As a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep our program going. So if you enjoy our presentations and would like to support this program, you can make a donation or become a member on our website, and we very much appreciate that. And so now let me introduce our guest speaker. Andrew Schulman was hailed by the New York Times for having, quote, graceful introspection and an ear for timbrel shading. He is a versatile musician. He's a solo guitarist, bandleader, medical musician, author, lecturer, and consultant in the field of music and medicine. Mr. Schulman has appeared as soloist throughout the United States and Europe in venues ranging from Carnegie Hall to Lincoln Center in New York City to the Royal Albert Hall and Chelsea Arts Club in London. Mr. Schulman was the resident musician in critical care at Beth Israel from 2010 to 2016, and then at NYU Langone in 2017. He was the medical musician in critical care at Berkshire Medical Center in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, from 2016 to 2020. He's now the visiting artist and medical musician in the Arts and Humanities Program at Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, D.C. In September 2017, he became the first musician to be accepted as a professional member of the Society of Critical Care Medicine. He was appointed to a 3-year term there on their ICU Liberation Committee in 2020, which was established to improve the conditions for patients in critical care. And Mr. Schulman was included to focus on the use of music to alleviate pain, help patients sleep better, and to prevent ICU delirium, which we're going to be talking about. In April 2018, he co-founded the Medical Musician Initiative, MMI, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The Medical Musician Initiative trains professional musicians in pertinent aspects of critical care medicine and related areas in order to incorporate them into ICU medical teams, thereby enhancing the healing process of critically ill patients using music as medicine. Andrew is the author of this book, Waking the Spirit, A Musician's Journey Healing Body, Mind, and Soul, which was chosen as an Oliver Sacks Foundation Best Book of the Year selection. And it really is a very wonderful, uplifting, inspiring, educational book. And I really loved it. I really enjoyed it. So, welcome, Andrew. And let's see. Yeah, my daughter just texted me saying she doesn't have the link, so I will send her the link. Andrew, could you start us off with telling us what inspired you to become a musician in the first place?
Oh, that's a big question. I grew up in a family that was very musical. And if I would give you a specific moment, I had two cousins, both from both sides of the family, who were a couple years older than me. They were both named Elliot. And there was a family get-together when I would have been about 8 years old. It was actually a Passover gathering in my grandmother's house in Brooklyn. And both of my cousins played the guitar, and after the meal there was music making, and these guys played. One of them, I have to mention, is named Elliot Lurie. And Elliot Lurie wrote and sang a very, very famous pop tune called Brandy. And you know the one I'm talking about? It's in Guardians of the Galaxy. It was from the 1974, I think it was, when it was it was a number one hit in the country. He's a very talented guy. And that was the first moment of being inspired. But my mother always sang, and my father, when he was young, was a musician. He played swing band violin in big bands in the late 30s, early 40s. And during World War II, it's a story that's in the book, in World War II, he wound up unexpectedly playing baritone sax in the United States Army dance band at Fort Dix, New Jersey, that toured the country. And that actually saved his life. Maybe we can come back to that story.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that story?
I want you to tell that story.
Yeah. That saved his life.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story. And so then what follows is tell us the story about how you became a medical musician.
Well, there is another story that's in the book that you will remember. The first influence on me to become a medical musician happened the day I was born. Remember that story?
Yes.
Well, I'll just tell it briefly. I was born in February 1952 at around 1 a.m. And around 7 a.m., this is a story that I heard every big holiday gathering for the first 15 years of my life. My grandma Molly always told this story. My grandma Molly, who's my maternal grandmother, all 5 foot tall of her, at 7 in the morning went down to the nursery and took a look at me and went back up to my mother's room. My mother was recuperating, and my father was sitting next to her. And she walked in and she said, my mother's nickname was Sippy. Her name was Sylvia, but everybody called her Sippy. And she said, Sippy, we've got to do something. That's not somebody from our family. They switched babies. She insisted she said he's too ugly to be our family. Now, I should jump ahead and say she sounds terrible when I tell this, the beginning of the story. She was a wonderful grandmother, but this was a very idiosyncratic morning. And she said they switched babies, and she insisted that the hospital do an investigation, which they did. They weren't too happy about that. Now, when I was 15 years old, at the end of a Thanksgiving meal, I was at one of my relatives' homes, and the cousin, the woman, I can't remember her name now, she's been gone for a long time, but it was one of my mother's cousins, my cousin, who came into the living room. I had gone out to sit on a sofa. I was a 15-year-old. I was probably morose about something. And Sorry about that. And she came over to me and she said, you know, they always tell that story about the nurses singing to you. Well, I mean the story about doing the investigation about whether they switch babies. And she said, I was there that morning also, and I went into the nursery and I heard the most beautiful thing. There were 4 nurses, and they knew about this investigation that was being done, and they were feeling sorry for you. And they put a blue ribbon in your hair, and they sang to you. And they were singing show tunes to you. And that was my introduction to the healing power of music. Now, the follow-up to that story is that 45 years later, I had gotten a gig in New York, a very prestigious gig. I was hired to play the Sunday brunch at the Plaza Hotel in the Palm Court. And in order to play that gig, I had to learn a lot more popular music. I was mostly a classical guitarist then. And I had to practice like crazy and do all of these arrangements. And at the end of each day, each working day, I would take a long walk on West End Avenue. And this melody kept playing over and over in my head. And I couldn't place it. It was just the opening fragment of the melody that played over and over in my head. And after a couple of weeks, though, one day, I'm walking, and the words came to me all of a sudden. Fish got to swim, birds got to fly. Fish got to swim, birds got to fly. Da-da-da-da. It Can't Help Loving That Man. From the musical Showboat. And as soon as I knew the name of the tune, an image came into my head of this story of the 4 nurses singing for me. Well, I went home and I was very curious about this. Could that have been what they were singing to me? I Googled it. In February 1952, when I was born, Can't Help Loving That Man had been reissued. There was a new version of it out, and it was the #1 pop tune in the country. Now, I'll never know for sure, is that what the nurses were singing? But I've spoken to some neuroscientists. I've spoken to people, medical people, about this. It's possible that a memory like that can connect from such an early age. The main thing is, it's very ironic that in my life, I was emotionally saved by music on the first day of my life. So that's the first part of the story. Second part of the story, you're asking how this happened, and it's the core story of my book, Waking the Spirit. In 2009, I had a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. Again, this is a very long story, so I'll just make it very, very short. It was in the surgery itself, it was discovered that the mass that was on my pancreas was benign. I didn't have cancer. And that was a miracle in itself. And as I relate in the book, my wife, Wendy, was in the waiting room at the end of the surgery. The surgeon, Dr. Martin Carpe Jr., went down to tell her this amazingly good news. But what he didn't know at that moment, while his resident up in the operating room was sewing me up and getting ready to take me to the surgical ICU, was that the following happened. When they put me on the gurney to take me to the ICU, I went into shock. I started going into shock. And
you were still unconscious.
I was unconscious. I was still under the anesthesia. Mm-hmm. So they put me on the gurney, and when they get to by the time they got to the door of the operating room, the anesthesiologist looked down and said, "This guy's blood pressure just bottomed out." And I had this memory always that somebody said, "Oh shit." Can we say that on YouTube? And I think so. And well, the race was on. It was about a 5-minute gurney ride from the operating room to the surgical intensive care unit. And by the time they arrived, I was clinically dead. By the time they got into the door. Now, the first thing that saved me, of the many things that saved me over the next few days, is that I was supposed to be at the end of the hall, way down. And there was a bed open right next to the entrance area. That's the first thing that saved me, because it was a matter of seconds. And they got me in there. It was an incredibly good team of ICU doctors and nurses, led by the director named Dr. Marvin McMillan, who figures very importantly in the story later. Mm-hmm. They resuscitated me, but I was terribly, terribly sick, and so they put me into a medically induced coma. This is at around 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, July 16th, 2009. I was so sick that at 3 a.m. I coded again. In other words, my heart stopped again, and they had to resuscitate me a second time. Nobody in that ICU, none of the doctors and nurses in that ICU thought that I would live. Nobody did. And my wife was there, of course, this whole time. She slept in the first night in the waiting room, and it was a terribly catastrophic situation. The next day was very, very bad, and Dr. McMillan did certain things that he really saved my life also. That was that second day, first full day. The day after that, things were difficult. Again, terrible, terrible. And it's on the third day, which was a Sunday, around noon, that we'll never know for sure, but I could have had a few minutes left to live or an hour left to live. I always like to tell this to doctors and nurses. My lactic acid number was 17. Normal is 1.8. People usually die by the time it gets to 10, and I was 17, so I didn't have much to live. This is then the culminating moment of what saved my life, is that my wife had been following everything. By this time, she knew how to read the vital signs monitor. She also knew from little things she heard the nurses saying, and just looking at their facial expressions, that the end was very, very near. And right around that time, she looked in her bag to get her cell phone to call my mother. My mother was not well and was not at the hospital. My wife was giving her up-to-the-minute reports. And she looked to call her, and she saw my iPod in the bag. And the light bulb went off over her head. And she turned to the attending physician, and she said, "His heart is beating, but his soul isn't. My husband loves music more than anything, and I believe that the only thing that can save his life now is music, because it will give him the will to live." Luckily for me, the attending physician that day, a doctor named Dr. Simon Iriff, was a really cool guy. A lot of doctors would not have followed through and put the iPod in, because you put the iPod in and then the guy drops dead immediately and he gets sued, right?
Why would he drop dead immediately?
Oh, I'm just saying, if they had put the iPod in and I died a minute later,
I see.
Doctors are always running this risk of malpractice.
Right.
But he didn't turn Wendy down. What he said was, put the earbuds in, put one earbud in his ear, one earbud in your ear. I'll give you 30 minutes. If there's any sign of agitation, you have to remove the earbud immediately. Now remember, I'm in a coma. My arms are restrained with cords because I had been trying to pull out lines and stuff like that, because when I got agitated. But he gave permission for the music to be played. Now, no one knew what to play for me, so they decided to just hit the first track on the iPod. And that's another thing that was fortuitous and that saved my life, because the very first track turned out to be my ultimate favorite piece of music, the St. Matthew Passion of Bach. It was BWV 244, alphabetically, numerically. That was the first track on the iPod. So they click it and the music begins. And you don't see anything happening at first, but gradually, over this half hour, Wendy's looking up at the vital signs monitor. The nurse standing there is watching it. The doctor would come by and watching it, and nobody could believe what they were seeing. All of the vital signs that were in terrible, terrible numbers all of a sudden start stabilizing. And by the end of the 30 minutes, I basically was well on my way to being stable. And the music, later on, the doctors, the nurses, everybody who's there, and my chart shows that the turnaround in my condition happens exactly at the time of the music being played. Later that afternoon, and there is something that Dr. McMillan called the blossoming effect of music, that even when the music was off, you know, when you play a piece of music and it keeps playing over in your head and you hear it hours later, well, that must have happened for me also. Because by the end of the afternoon, all of that lactic acid that was killing me started leaching out of my tissues. Everything else, the kidney numbers were better. Everything was getting better. And by the middle of the evening, Dr. Iriff went over to my wife and said, "You're not going to believe this, but we're cautiously optimistic now that he's out of the woods." Mm-hmm. So it's that third day of the coma, Bach's St. Matthew Passion, and the power of music to heal that absolutely saved my life.
Yeah, because you remained stable, right? They monitored you for another 3 days or so, you know, just in case, and you never lost that stability.
Never lost the stability. And so they took 3 days to slowly wean. That what they had to do is, I was on a ventilator. It's the apparatus that enables you to breathe. Mm-hmm. And they had to slowly wean me off the ventilator, which took 3 days. And it was in the seventh day. In the Bible, on the seventh day you rest. But for me, on the seventh day, I had to wake up. I was done resting and everything. So they brought me out of the coma very gradually. And that's an amazing experience, to come out when the shift from a coma back into reality is pretty extraordinary. I was looking at the book. I haven't read the book in a long time. The book was released 6 years ago. But I've been looking through the last few days, looking through the book, and I had a lot of fun revisiting that scene where you
didn't even realize that you had been in a coma.
No.
You thought you were waking up from surgery.
That's right. I thought I was waking up for surgery. The final, the end scene in the coma is that, and there's something called coma dreams, which I talk about a little bit in the book. Coma dreams are not real dreams. It's basically it's hallucinations, really, that you're having that are caused by the drugs that you're on. And the very last coma dream I had, I was looking at a mystical spinning disc. And on this disc, it started out with the first creation of life billions of years ago. And I watched as life kept evolving from one-cell organisms to the whole thing. At one point, I was looking at dinosaurs. Mm-hmm. And then at one point, I'm seeing people. And for whatever reason, I got up to the Romans, the ancient Romans, wearing those red capes and everything. I had just been reading before the surgery some Roman history, and that's, I'm sure, why it happened that way. And all of a sudden, the disc went blank. And there was a transition. And the transition was that all of a sudden I realized that it was not a spinning magical disc. It was a light fixture above my bed. All of a sudden I'm looking, I realize I'm not sitting up, I'm lying on my back, I'm in a bed, and I'm looking at the light above me. And that was the moment where I was out of the coma.
And you tell them about how you thought you were watching this jazz band playing minimalist music.
Oh, right. One of the coma dreams was that several times over these 7 days that I was in this coma, I kept revisiting a jazz club in New York City on 8th Avenue and 55th Street. Now, later I realized why the jazz club was at 8th Avenue, 55th Street. There's a rehearsal studio on 8th Avenue and 55th Street that I used to take my string band to for years. That's where we rehearsed and everything. So that explains all of this material comes from your brain, all the information that's in there. And I would, at 4 in the morning, each day for some reason it was at 4 in the morning, I would sit down next to a window looking into the jazz club, and it was this trio it was a jazz trio that was in there, and they were playing this minimalist music, and they kept repeating the melody, and it was a jagged kind of ba-da-da-da-da-da, ba-da-da-da-da-da, and it kept repeating over and over. And in the dream, in the coma dream, it was just this weird, strange, and fascinating kind of moment. I'd see these jazz players keep repeating this melody, and then the dream would turn into another dream. So on the first full day, I was woken up on a Wednesday. It was a Thursday, which was the first full day that I was out of the coma. And I'm lying in bed, and Wendy's sitting on my left reading a book. And all of a sudden, I hear something, and I start laughing. And she goes, "What's so funny?" And I said, "I just realized who the jazz trio was." There was a ventilator machine in the patient next to me. The warning signal when something is wrong on the ventilator machine was that exact melody I was hearing the jazz musicians play. So when you're in a coma, the very important aspect of this story is that when somebody's in a coma, I know this is true for medically induced coma, and I'm assuming that it's true if it's a non-induced coma. That person is still in there. You are still in there, and you are hearing everything that's going on around you. And the important lesson to be learned from that, once I understood that right on this first day out of the coma, which carried over into the work I did as a medical musician. If you're at the bedside of somebody who's in a coma, be careful what you say. And be careful of what sounds that you make, because that person can hear everything. Now, I don't know this for a fact. This is not something, I don't know if anybody's done a study of this. I'm just saying this intuitively, that if you are next to somebody who's in a coma, I don't think there's anything I heard that got translated in a reality sense. If somebody was standing next to me and talking, and there were coma dreams that were based on things that were being said, what happens is that the patient who's in the coma your mind, your brain receives this information and it twists it around because you're hallucinating. But what I do think is that the vibration you're giving off in what you're saying is picked up by that patient. So I have had conversations with people who've told me about a loved one, a friend, or a family member who was in a coma, and doctors were in there saying things that were really inappropriate. Especially, for instance, you don't want to say this, this person's condition is hopeless. I think that translates. You can't do things like that, because when it comes down to these life and death situations, sometimes everything is hanging by a thread. And we talk about good energy. When somebody's that sick, you need good energy all the time, because you can be on the precipice. I was on the precipice and everything. Again, there is no question in anybody's mind who was there and who knows this information that music, that St. Matthew Passion, literally saved my life. There is no question about that. And it's the energy that came from that music that did it. So you have to be extremely careful in every way when you're next to a critically ill person.
Yeah, and I wonder how many doctors are aware of that, because I think that it makes me think that the kind of music that's played would be crucial. And when you're in an operating room, the doctors, some surgeons like to play music, but the music is, according to their taste, not
Right.
the patient's.
Right.
And what if their taste is heavy metal or something? I would think that would be devastating for the patient. And I think they should ask people what kind of music, and it should be played according to what the patient likes.
I feel very strongly about that. That's something that I'm going to try to keep two things in my head right now to address with this. When you asked about how many doctors or nurses know that about the coma patient, I would on occasion be playing for a coma patient. And I remember a number of times where doctors, it was once actually a chaplain said this. I've had nurses say this. I'd be at a coma patient bedside and somebody would say to me, "Why are you doing that? They can't hear you."
Oh no.
Yes.
Nurse?
Yeah. Yes. Maybe not a nurse. The nurses are the best people in the unit. Dr. McMillan said when I first started playing there, he said, if you want to know what's going on with the patient, ask the nurse. I'm a super fan of nurses for a number of reasons. But I would have people say, why are you doing that? And what my response to that always was just to smile and not say, I didn't answer them. First of all, they're saying that to me when I'm at the bedside. Anyway, that's not the place to have that conversation. And over the years, there were a few of those people where later I would see them, maybe in the hallway, and explain to them that, no, take it from me, absolutely. You hear them. So many of my coma dreams were based on what I was hearing and also what I was seeing. Because you think a coma patient can't see anything, but the eyes do open sometimes. And there were absolutely coma dreams that I had of things that I did see. Now, I said there were two things in mind. The other thing I want to go back to is what you said about doctors playing music in the operating room. And I have in the book a little anecdote about that. I was listening to the radio one day, and it was a talk show on WQXR No, it was WNYC. It was WNYC FM. It was a talk show. And it was a young doctor. The show was about music and healing. It was a guest from Boston. I don't remember his name, a doctor who does music and medicine. And a young doctor called in and said, I want to tell you this, that some experience I had. There was a surgery on a heart patient, and the surgeon liked to play heavy metal. And he was blasting it, and the young doctor was a resident and was there for that surgery. And he said, I can't prove this, but towards the end of that surgery, blasting music, and it's heart surgery, the patient died on the table. And you're absolutely right. Can the patient on an operating room under anesthesia hear that? Yes, of course you're hearing it and everything. Is it in your consciousness the way it would be if you were not under anesthesia? No, it's different, but the patient is hearing it. I have had the experience of some surgical procedures I've had since where I had to go under anesthesia, where the doctors played music, and they did ask me and about actually one of the questions a few years ago on a surgery I had was, did I mind if they played my music? And I said, yes, don't play my music, because I'm going to be lying there thinking, no, I didn't play that right, I didn't play that, don't play my music. But so where is this now in the world of medicine? It's all over the place. It's all over the place. Music absolutely is increasingly being accepted in the medical field, but it has a long, long way to go. Let me go right into this then right now. As you said in your introduction for me, I am a member of the Society of Critical Care Medicine, and I'm in my third year on a very important committee called the ICU Liberation Committee, which is all about improving the conditions for a more humane and a more healing environment in the ICU. It's a fabulous committee. They're doing incredible work. They've developed something called an A to F bundle, which is A represents things, B, C, D. I won't go through what they all mean right now, but it's just dealing with how you deal with pain, how you deal with sleep, how you deal with all these different issues. I'm doing the best I can right now to influence this organization to including music in the healing environment. And it has a long ways to go. But I will tell you this, a medical musician, which is what I am, and one of our Zoom members who's on the screen right now, Jenzy Silverman from Minnesota, is also, she took two of our workshops over the last few years, and she's at a Minnesota hospital now as a medical musician. A medical musician who is has the proper training to play in an intensive care unit is absolutely, unquestionably, a very valuable member of the medical team. And we can go into this a little bit more later. The field of music and medicine is a big field. The central profession in that field are the music therapists, which has been, music therapy as a profession has been around since 1950. There is another designation called Certified Music Practitioners. Those are people who train from an organization called Music for Genzy, click in here.
Yep. Music for Healing and Transition.
And Transition, yes.
Is the organization. Yeah. And there's another one called Harp for Healing that does pretty much, it's very identical qualifications and training to MHTP, but their graduates are called Certified Clinical Musicians.
Okay.
But the aim is the same, training musicians to provide music for individual patients at the bedside.
Thank you, Jensen.
Where did you get your music therapy training?
Okay, so I'm not a music therapist.
Oh, okay.
And I have no formal training at all, which, but I had, for being a musician in ICU, I had the best possible training you could ever have, because I was allowed to return to the ICU where I was a patient.
Right, yeah.
Well, let me start from the beginning. When I left the hospital, I was a patient for 12 days, which in itself was kind of miraculous, because the estimate that they made on the second day of after the catastrophe happened was that if I lived, there's a great little moment in the book. It's Dr. McMillan talking to his chief physician assistant in his office at the end of the first full day. And he said, if this guy lives, and he's not going to live, he actually said that, this guy's toast, he's not going to live. But if he does live, we have to plan ahead. And they had to make an estimate. And the estimate was that I would be in the ICU for 30 days. I would then be in the step-down unit for 2 weeks. And then I would be in a regular room for another 2 weeks. That was the minimum that they thought. A minimum of about 2 months in the hospital. Probably more. Now, I was only in the hospital for 12 days. I was only in the ICU for 10 days. They skipped step down, and they put me in a regular room, which I was only in a regular room for 2 days. McMillan has said that no one will ever know in medical terms how I survived the catastrophic medical situation. And the answer to that, though, is the music saved me, but that's not a medical data. you can't, that's not science, but everybody knows that's what happened. Why I was able to come out so fast is, and this is kind of, we're out of circling around on this right now. On that, something happened on that first full day out of the coma. This is probably a good time to jump into that, and we'll come back to the medical teams in a little bit. Let's not forget that. I want to round that out. But the morning of the first full day out of the coma, at 8 in the morning, Wendy arrived at my bedside. And remember, this is 8 days after the surgery, and I'm now fully out of the coma. And when they had reasons to believe that I had brain damage. I was in brain ischemia for 17 minutes right after the surgery. Brain ischemia means that the flow of blood to your brain has slowed down to a trickle, and it's potentially fatal. And I was in ischemia for 17 minutes. Well, on this 8th day, on this morning, when Wendy shows up at 8 a.m. at the bedside, I look up and I see her, and I went, "Hi, Wendy." And no slurred speech. I knew who she was, so on and so forth. And that was a really amazing moment. And she sits down next to me, and what she said was this. She said, "Your surgery was not yesterday." She realized that I would think I was just in the ICU after the surgery. She said, "Your surgery was 8 days ago. the doctor saved your life afterwards and put you into, and you've been in a coma for 8 days, and you don't have cancer. And I was silent. She remembers it as a full minute. For years afterwards, she said that full minute of silence for me was the longest she'd ever heard me silent when I wasn't playing my guitar. In that moment, and this is the story about my father, which we'll tell a little bit later, but in that moment of being silent, I realized that a miracle had happened, and I realized that my life had been saved and something extraordinary had happened. And I didn't want to have happen to me what happened to my father, which we'll explain in a little bit, where he had survivor's guilt because of something that happened to him. And I was immediately conscious of survivor's guilt. And I realized if something miraculous happened, I've been saved, I don't want to go through what my father had and have survivor's guilt. And in order for that not to happen, I'd have to do something. And it came to me immediately that what I had to do was give back. And I realized I couldn't give back to this hospital by donating money. I didn't have any money to give them. Mm-hmm. The only thing I had was my guitar. And I did not know yet at this point that music had saved my life. This is completely intuitive. I remember looking across the hall. There was, in what would have been bed 12, there was an elderly woman who looked like she was in a lot of pain, and I was hearing also moans and groans coming from around me. I knew that I was in a room that was very gloomy. And at the end of that minute, I looked at Wendy and I said, this room needs music. I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to play music. I'm going to play my guitar for people. So that was very intuitive, and it was a turning point, and it all comes out of that. Now, if you think I can remember how we got to this moment in the conversation, how did we get here? Where were we?
Well, you came out of the coma and you decided to give back by playing music for the...
Oh, you asked me. I know what it is. You asked me about my training. What training I had.
Oh, yeah.
What I training in music I had. Okay. I knew there had to be a reason I had to tell that story, so you know that how I wound up going back, why and how I wound up going back. Well, right. I had to recover. It took 6 months. And when I recovered, well, I have to step back for a minute. When we left the hospital on that 12th day, Wendy arranged it that we would stop by the surgical ICU so I could meet Dr. McMillan. He had met me, but I'd never met him. I was dead when he first saw me. And then he had gone off duty on my 3rd day before I came out of the coma. I was not out of the coma. And he was just back on duty. He had been off for about 6 or 7 days. And he was back on now. And when we, when you leave a hospital when you were in that condition, the regulations are they have to take you out in a wheelchair, even if you could walk. So they wheeled me down there. And when they wheeled me into the ICU, it was a Monday morning in the summer, at the end of July, and it was a very, very slow day, fortunately. And McMillan was standing in the middle of the ICU, holding a little meeting with 4 or 5 doctors and nurses standing around him. And as they wheeled me up, I remember that McMillan and a couple of the doctors and nurses, they looked in our direction, and I saw them look at me looking puzzled. Nobody recognized me. Mm-hmm. But another second or two went by, and they looked, and they saw it was Wendy. And these were all doctors who had been there just in the first 2 days, who assumed that I was not going to live. Mm-hmm. When they saw Wendy, they realized who I was. And there is an expression that you could say somebody looked like they just saw a ghost. Mm-hmm. That's a real thing. I saw people do that. It's a shock to the system. They went, this guy lived? And so I had this wonderful 10-minute chat with Macmillan about different things. One of the first thing I said to him is, I said, thank you for saving my life. And he said something really wonderful. He said, we don't save your life. We just keep your body alive long enough so your body saves your life. That's incredibly humble coming from a doctor, especially a surgeon. He's a very, very unusual guy.
I'd like to take this moment, since you're speaking about Dr. Macmillan, who, for the sake of our attendees, I don't know if he still is, he was the director of the surgical ICU at Beth Israel Medical Center, which is where you were.
Yeah.
And there was a documentary made of, your experience and how you got, what happened to you, and how you decided to become a medical musician, and he figures prominently in that documentary. Yeah. And I'd like to just play a couple of clips from that, if
sure. That's great.
Okay, so this is Dr. Macmillan talking. Hold on. Here we go.
When Andrew plays in the intensive care unit now, he will walk up to a family member at the bedside and a critically ill patient in the bed and say, "Hi, I'm Andrew. I'm the ICU musician." He says, "Well, I come play Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for patients in the intensive care unit." The vast majority of patients are intubated. They're on a breathing machine, and they can't talk.
Hi. So you sing? Not today. What do you like to sing? I know you know this one.
So a lot of his interaction is with the family member sitting at the bedside. And honestly, sometimes the family member's emotional state can be as important as the patient. There's an interesting set of experiments. They found that when the family member's heart rate goes up, the patient's heart rate goes up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. How you feeling better? Yeah, your numbers look good.
We're learning through medical care that patients aren't just patients that we heal. It's about the context, the families. Don't ask me when I take my meds, ask my wife. So we start to see how important, and this is an area of music therapy that's growing, to include the family in the music making. Parts of the brain light up all over when familiar music is played. We know that these musical maps and sequencings, they connect to our will, our desire, and our passion.
I think music can be critical. It can be as important as a ventilator in an intensive care unit. It could be as important as a dialysis machine. It could be as important as the medications which we treat people's blood pressure with.
It's fate in a way that brought Andrew here. He clearly puts love into his playing, and you feel it.
Thank you, sir.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yes.
You know what that was?
Sounds familiar.
That was Bach. And it was a melody from the St. Matthew Passion. And that music saved my life when I was in a coma. It literally saved my life. When I came out of the coma, Wendy came in that first morning and told me everything that had happened. I didn't know I was in a coma. I thought I had cancer. I didn't know any of that stuff. And she explained the whole thing in just a few sentences. A whole bunch of things went through my head, but I saw this elderly woman in bed 12 directly across the hall from me, and she was in so much pain, and I heard people from beds around me moaning and groaning, beeps of machines, medical machines going off, and I thought, this place really needs music. And that was the moment when I thought the way to give thanks was to come back as a musician. I'm a professional musician. I could do it.
It's almost like a Pied Piper in a way. I mean, he's in the intensive care unit and his music infiltrates the entire unit.
He's tried to make a connection. He's tried to say, who is this sick person in the bed? And he's left you with a really compelling statement of hopefulness. And people get through this. He's breached the loneliness in a way that only a survivor of critical illness themselves could do.
Music is like a beacon of light that the patient's ear is drawn to, and for many, it's a salvation, and it helps them heal faster, and it gives them something to latch onto, and that one of the main purposes of my being there is to bring in normal life into this extremely unnatural setting.
Music takes you out of this alien, cold, unfamiliar, hostile, painful world and reconnects you with the things you care the most about. An intensive care unit is about the world's worst healing environment. I would say I don't know what the world's best healing environment is, but I know it doesn't look like an ICU. And so anything we can do to normalize or familiarize the environment is probably going to be good for the patient's brain and recovery. It's not entertainment. The key thing is this is not something to help critically ill and ICU patients pass the time.
When I play at bed 5 in a little while, I'll play your favorite song. Come to bed 5.
Thank you.
There's very good reasons to think that this is part of their treatment. And when you look at all the money that is wasted in healthcare, the idea of an intensive care unit musician sounds crazy to most people at first blush, but it's really a very inexpensive, very patient-oriented thing that we've been exploring for 5 or 6 years.
You know, I'll play for you an old favorite. My dad loved this too. I always tell people it's like playing in a restaurant.
Really?
Because you never know what's going to be from day to day.
CQ restaurant.
Except that generally the food is a lot better at a restaurant.
I think, yeah.
All right.
Gloria, can I jump right in on something?
Yes.
Thank you for playing all of that. The film is called Andrew and Wendy, and the director and producer is named Josh Aronson. It was done in 2015. That film was played on PBS TV stations all over the country for a few years. It was wonderful to be part of it. But what you just demonstrated for me, to give credence to the most important message I have to say about music and medicine, is that you heard the doctors themselves, McMillan and Carpe, say, my belief and the reason that I co-founded the Medical Musician Initiative back in 2018 is that if every hospital in the world had a resident medical musician or music therapist or one of the other music and medicine entities involved, it would be very, very valuable to everything that's going on there. Valuable. You have three constituencies in an ICU. It's the patients, then their family and friends, and then the medical staff. And when you have a trained musician who knows how to operate in that environment, it's a huge plus. And McMillan also said, in terms of its cost, it's incredibly, even if you pay the musician well, which you should, that's still nothing compared to what so many of the medications and technologies cost and everything. So is there music everywhere? No. It's still far from it. I think that the medical music and medicine field is probably still, I don't know this for sure, but from what I gather, it is making good strides every year, but it's nowhere near what it really should be. This is a good moment. I'm sure people listening to this right now are wondering about specifics, and I'll give you a few specifics.
Yes, please.
The first one is blood pressure. Blood pressure is an issue that can be very, very dangerous to a critical care patient in an ICU if it gets too high. Okay? Now, when it gets too high, especially the magic number is 160. Once it goes above 160, it's really dangerous and gets worse from there. What the standard of practice is right now is that that's treated with medication. Now, I can't, you have to take my word for this one I'm about to say, because, I don't have data proof. Data is the big thing, scientific proof. That's what medicine is based on. So I don't have the data, but from anecdotal experience, I can tell you I have hundreds and hundreds of times gone to a bedside. Here's a short little anecdote that will demonstrate what I'm trying to say right now. That also touches on something else. It's the anecdote that I use when I'm describing what does it take to become trusted as a part of the medical team. This is a true story that happened at one of the hospitals I played, Berkshire Medical Center in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I live in New York City, but I would go up there. I was up there for 4 years, where I'd go up once a month for 3 or 4 days at a time at the end of the month. There was a nurse who was very, very skeptical about having a musician in the unit. Mm-hmm. And this is the story of how that changed. I had come up, I was on my first day of my monthly visit. This is about the third month that I was up there. And I went to a bedside. It was one of her patients. And the blood pressure was something over 160. Now, in the medical field, we're used to saying like 120 over 80. The doctors and nurses don't care about the second number. They only care about the first number. So the patient was somewhere in the 160s, and I played for about 20 minutes for this patient. At the end of 20 minutes, the blood pressure was 120 something. And I remember at the corner of my eye, I saw this nurse and walking past me, and she looked at the vital sign monitor. She saw the number, and she looked as skeptical as before. If I was reading her mind, I'd say she thought, okay, the blood pressure came down, but that doesn't mean it was from the music. The next day, I had another patient I went to, also in the 160s, and it was her patient again. And about 20 minutes of music, and the blood pressure is about 120. Now I look at her, and I see she's thinking. Mm-hmm. And on the third day, this is the only time in 10 years I did this that I ever had a situation like this. It was just coincidence that The third day was another patient in the 160s, and it was her patient. It was another 20 minutes of music, and the blood pressure was in the 120s. And when I finished playing, she walked over to me and she leaned in close and she said, "Andrew, can we go to bed too now?" In other words, I'd won her over. She accepted me as a member of the medical team. And as I was telling the story, by the way, I had this thought, a question that's often asked of me. If the blood pressure went from 160 to 120, how long did it stay at 120? Was it just momentarily? When the music stopped, did it change? My experience with that is that in most cases that I've seen things like that happen, once you get the blood pressure down, it stays down. And it probably has something to do with Macmillan's term of the blossoming effect of music.
Were all of these patients conscious or unconscious?
It varied.
Yeah.
And so that I don't forget, I want to recommend a book that's called Every Deep Drawn Breath. And it was written by a doctor named Dr. Wes Ely, E-L-Y. And I have a connection to this book in that Wes Ely is a colleague of mine and a friend of mine. He's at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And I'm happy to give a shout out that the author of the book, the editor of the book, is a woman named Lindsay Tate, who edited Awaking the Spirit. She's a wonderful, wonderful editor. Mm. Now, his book is all about critical care, and the core issue in that book is about ICU delirium. Mm. What ICU delirium is that if you have a patient in an ICU, and it usually happens when they're heavily medicated, and there are a bunch of different factors that go into ICU delirium. But what happens basically is that this patient, from the factors of the painkillers that they're on, the pain medication they're on, and different medications, and their own anxiety about their situation, that patient goes into a delirious state. And it's very, very dangerous. Macmillan told me that for many years, the medical profession didn't think ICU delirium was such a big deal. They thought, well, the person might be in the state for a few days, but then they come out of it and they're okay. And then enough studies were done that showed, no, once a patient goes into ICU delirium, the long-term effects are very, very serious. Right. Lots and lots of problems come out of ICU delirium. So, in my book, Waking the Spirit, the prologue of the book begins with an ICU delirium patient. I walk into the unit and I hear a strange sound. I didn't even realize it's a human voice at first. Then I realized it's a voice, and the nurses ran and got me and brought me to the bedside immediately, because they had this woman who was in a terrible state of ICU delirium for about 2 hours at that point, tying down 3 nurses. And this was just in the first couple of months that I started doing this. And a lot of what you do as a medical musician, which is true also of doctors and nurses, is intuitive. You have to be very, very intuitive. And what my intuition told me in that moment was that playing Bach was going to be the right thing for her. And I played a Bach prelude. People who know that music will know it's the guitar version of the first cello suite prelude, which is a very, very famous piece. And in that case, it took literally 10 seconds of this music to start bringing this patient out of the delirium. It didn't take her out completely, but in the first 10 seconds of the music, you could see that the beginnings were there for taking her out of this delirium. I wound up playing for her for 90 minutes, and by the end of the 90 minutes, she was out of the delirium. some people, I think Gen Z Silverman has told me that her favorite chapter in the book is over the rainbow chapter. The patient, I'm allowed to use her name because she gave me permission. Her name is Dina Rosenberg, and that was a woman who was in very deep state of ICU delirium, and I was going to Beth Israel at that point Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. On the Monday and Wednesday I was there, I spent each day, the full day, at her bedside. And the music that really brought her out the most was Gershwin. And it turns out that Dina Rosenberg is one of the world's leading authorities on the music of Gershwin, of the Gershwins.
And you were playing that just intuitively.
Intuitively. I looked at her and I just, who knows how this intuition thing works? You know, I it's a mystery. But so when if you I give the example that my personal experience is that medical music done in the right way can be one of the most, if not the most effective way of treating a high blood pressure patient. Mm-hmm. Well, what value is that? Tremendous value, right? That also the music used in the right way can be extremely effective with ICU delirium. Mm-hmm. Oh my God, if you put that into every ICU in the world, and if you had a medical musician or a music therapist, if you had a trained musician as a member of the medical team several days a week in that ICU, it's extremely valuable. So it's valuable in the obvious way of, first of all, helping to heal a patient, in a humane way of looking at it. Of course, that's incredibly valuable. Well, it's financially incredibly valuable because it doesn't cost much to have the musician there, especially compared to everything else, like Macmillan said. And you bring your cost down. The most expensive unit in a hospital is the critical care unit.
Yeah. The pharmaceutical companies might not be in favor of it.
No, they would not be in favor of it.
Right. I would like to play an audio of a piece that you have recorded for our attendees so they can get an idea. And but there was something I wanted to say about Bach before I turn that on, and that is the Dr. Arthur Harvey, who is a neuromusicologist. He said, of all the music we tested in medical school with patients, colleagues, and others, Bach's music consistently made the brain work in a balanced way better than any other genre. So I want to play this fugue.
And when the fugue is over, I didn't remember this until yesterday, but there is an anecdote about this exact fugue that's in the book, towards the end of the book, and I'll tell you when the music is over.
Okay. That was so beautiful and so beautifully played.
Thank you so much.
And if I'm ever in the ICU, I want my kids to call you up and have you come and play that for me.
Well, may you live past 100 and never be in an ICU.
Right. I was thinking of, well, let me read a quote here by Albert Einstein that's in your book. At the beginning of each chapter, you have this little historical, account of some period in history and some culture that considered music very important in healing. And this is a quote by Albert Einstein, who said, "If I were not a physicist, I would probably be a musician. I often think in music. I live my daydreams in music. I see my life in terms of music. I cannot tell if I would have done any creative work of importance in music, but I do know that I get most joy in life out of my violin." And I never even knew he played a violin, so that was really quite charming.
Yes.
Something I thought of when we were playing, and what was it? Oh, why is the guitar the ideal instrument for an ICU?
Okay. I think it is, and a lot of the medical people I've worked with have also remarked on that.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing is that it has an acoustic guitar, especially a classical guitar, has a very intimate sound with a very rich timbre. Mm-hmm. So the sheer sound of it is very appealing, it's very alluring, and that's exactly what you want in that setting, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't say this jokingly. If you take an obvious example of an instrument you wouldn't use would be a trumpet. It's too loud, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
The other thing about the guitar is that musically it's a very complete instrument, meaning as a guitarist when I'm playing the melody, the harmonies, and the bass line at the same time, as a piano would do. Mm-hmm. So Andre Segovia used to say that a guitar is like looking through a telescope in reverse, that it's a miniature orchestra. The guitar is a miniature orchestra. Mm. Another thing is that the highest note of a guitar is roughly in the range of the highest note of a female voice, and the lowest note of the guitar is in the range of the lowest note of the male voice. So the guitar is a very human instrument in its sound, in its range. Mm-hmm. It's also that it's very portable, and it doesn't take up much space. When you're in an ICU at a bedside, you have to be out of the way. That's why also in the Medical Musician Initiative workshops that we do, we train medical musicians as soloists, because the biggest issue is space. And a soloist really obviously is going to be the best solution for that. So those are the general reasons.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to tell us a little bit about another case? Maybe Alice Blue Gown, or I could read
Yeah, you said that about the
Mr. G.
Mr. G. Why don't you do that?
Okay, I'm going to read about Mr. G. I love this case. One Friday afternoon, a little over 2 months after my return, I was setting up when a nurse gave me a message. Dr. McMillan had left it for me before going off duty. I should go to bed 9 as soon as I arrived. He thought the patient was slipping into dysphoria. Dysphoria is like a state of despair, deep depression, I guess. I still remembered the cold fear of my own brush with this deep depression and I knew how dangerous a condition it was in the SICU, that's the surgical ICU, especially for older patients. They could slide suddenly into it and never regain their equilibrium. I'd read that music offers a real clinical benefit to patients suffering from depression, and I hoped I could help. I'd seen the patient in bed 9 earlier in the week. We called him Mr. G. He was a black man in his 70s with longish gray hair and a grizzled beard. He was very cheerful the first time I saw him, telling everyone in sight that he was a musician and even singing as people walked by. He'd been doing well, and there were some other very critical patients, so I hadn't gone to his bedside. He was decidedly less cheerful the second time I saw him. I knew he was a jazz musician, a saxophonist. I'd recognized his name. He'd been in New York a long time and was a highly respected sideman, a musician in a supporting role who can make the difference in a band sounding great, not just good. When I went over to bed 9 now, Mr. G was in a bad way, writhing in the bed, his face contorted. His nurse, Penny, told me that although his eyes were shut tight, he was awake. She thought it was more psychological suffering than physical pain. Earlier, he'd been talking about his fear of dying. As I looked at him, I tried to figure out how to help. How could I reach this fellow musician and pull him out of that deep sadness and fear? I remembered the way Nurse Karen Gottlieb had spoken to me, the care she had shown. I wanted to do that for this patient. I went and got my folder of old jazz standards, tunes I used to jam on with a dear friend, a sax player, and instead of pulling up a chair and sitting as I normally did, I stood in front of Mr. G's bed. I started slow with some solo arrangements of lyrical tunes, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, Misty, one or two others. Within a few minutes, the writhing slowed and then stopped, and the pained expression on his face started to disappear. I had his attention. He was listening to music he was listening to music he'd certainly played many times. Now I wanted him to do more than listen. I wanted him to think about playing. I switched from a solo style, left out the melody part, and began to play only the chords of the tunes. I wanted him to imagine an ensemble. The guitar, like the piano, can be a self-contained unit, meaning it can play the melody, harmony, and bass line simultaneously, as we just heard. So I figured if I left out the melody and went to chords, maybe that would send a signal to Mr. G. I moved to tunes with faster tempos now as well. Ain't Misbehavin', All the Things You Are. By the time I got to Take the A Train, Penny and I both saw a remarkable change in his face. His eyes remained closed, but his brow began to furrow, just as a musician's would when he's deeply in the flow of playing. You can't go into someone's mind and see them playing a saxophone solo, like a CT scan can show the details of the cerebral cortex, but it sure looked to me like Mr. G was on a bandstand, playing his horn full tilt. The signal had gotten through. I'm convinced he was playing the melody. I continued playing music in the same vein for another 30 minutes, the longest session I had done yet for one patient. Penny, looking at the vital signs monitor over the bed, told me there was a noticeable improvement. His heart rate and blood pressure had been very high, and now they were back in the normal range. Some of his anxiety and stress had ebbed away. More important, as an experienced nurse, she could tell that he was moving past a crisis. The music had done more than the sedatives had been able to accomplish. By getting Mr. G to interact, he had re-engaged in his life and reconnected to a core part of himself. He was pulling himself up from the bottom of the well. Music had intervened at just the right moment for Mr. G and had brought about a dramatic change in his health. I was deeply moved and amazed. I found out later from Macmillan that Mr. G had pulled through, and although still critically ill, had shown no more signs of dysphoria in the remaining week he was in the SICU. It was astonishing to me that 45 minutes or so of music could have turned the ship around to that degree. Miss Macmillan explained that there is a blossoming effect once things start moving in the right direction. He was an avid sailor in his college years, and once explained this effect to me in another way. Quote, once you catch the wind in your sails, you can get to where you want to go, unquote. He had told me that was what was happening when I listened to the St. Matthew Passion. Although I had long since stopped staring at Bet 11 as I walked into the SICU, I hadn't yet lost the feeling that I was there once and that I could be again one day. I definitely felt a connection with all the patients in the SICU. However, Mr. G was the first person who really made me think back to what had happened when I had pulled out of my coma. I saw how music reached beyond everything that was going on with him, mentally and physically, found his essence, and pulled him back. And it resonated because somehow that had happened to me too. Music intervened for both of us, stabilized us, and enabled the doctors and nurses to do their job. It was impressive and inspiring. So I love that story, and it's just one of many stories that are just inspiring. So thank you, Andrew.
Gen Z, I see Gen Z, right?
Yeah. Gloria, I'm so glad that you picked the Mr. G story to share with us. That has always been one of my favorites, Andrew. And I just wanted to share about a Mr. G-like experience I had in one of my hospital music gigs about 3.5 years ago. I was playing in the lobby of one of our Twin Cities area hospitals, and I was playing my tenor recorder, which is just a melody instrument. And I was in a Great American Songbook mood that day, and so I was playing a lot of jazz and show tune standards too. And this gentleman comes walking down the hall to the lobby, and he sat down. And when I took a break from playing, he was like, oh, I'm enjoying that very much. And while you were playing those songs, and he named everyone I was playing, he knew them all. He was like, yeah, I was improvising with you in my head. So it was kind of a converse situation where I was playing the melody and he was hearing the harmony parts in his head. Turns out he was also a Black jazz musician who happened to be originally from New York City. He had moved here, and he had been a reed player, so he also played sax and clarinet, and he knew the whole repertoire, and he was obviously in much better shape than Mr. G. He had told me what had been going on with him, and he was recovering. But it was obvious that he was really enjoying playing in his head. With me.
I thought that was just a brilliant strategy on Andrew's part. To leave out the melody so that Mr. G would engage that much more fully with what he was hearing and fill in the melody. And I bet you anything he was.
Well, thank you, Gloria. You know, as we're talking over this Zoom that we're doing here right now, one of the things that's striking me so much right now, from my own experience and from the experiences of other musicians that I know that have done therapeutic music, is what a shame that the medical profession has not yet fully embraced this. I mean, Macmillan is, of all the doctors who've talked about this, the best spokesman I've ever heard is Dr. Macmillan, and we heard him in the film and everything. And it's just going to take a lot of work to keep moving with this, but it's such an obvious thing. You mentioned that in between each chapter in the book, there's a few paragraphs about the history of music and medicine, going all the way back to
shamanism.
shamanism and different cultures and everything. Music was an integral part of medicine for thousands of years. And it was so up until about it starts falling out in the 19th century, when in Europe and the United States, medicine becomes much more science-based. Yeah. And basically what happened is the doctors said, music is not science, let's get rid of it. And we were to a great extent pushed out of medical care. Mm-hmm. It starts returning. Actually, the beginning is, and there's a chapter in the book about this, about the history of music and medicine. It's called the chapter 7, Everything Vibrates. Mm-hmm. It starts coming back a little bit at the American Civil War, because at the hospitals for the wounded soldiers, I think this was in the North, in the Union hospitals, they started bringing local musicians in to play for the boys, and they saw that helped. This happens even more in World War I, and even to a greater extent in World War II. Mm-hmm. And it's after World War II, as I said, in 1950 there was a very big national convention of people who were already calling themselves music therapists, and that's the beginning of music therapy as a profession. Mm-hmm. Now this continues. The real turnaround of what brings us back increasingly is actually science. It's in the 1980s and 1990s when they start doing a lot of brain scans with the MRIs and CT scans and all of that. And there were a lot of studies that were done. I don't know if it was a lot, but there were studies that were done of scanning the brain while people were listening to music. And lo and behold, they learned something that is, I have a quote in the book from Dr. Oliver Sacks, and I can't do the quote verbatim, but basically he said something to the effect of, no other stimulus activates more of the brain at the same time than the stimulus of music. That's actually why it works.
Right.
Here's another thing that along those lines that I'll put in here right now of why does music work as medicine? And that it was also discovered through medical research that when you play music for people, the music goes in through the auditory, in your ear, through the auditory nerve to the auditory cortex, and travels and lights up the whole brain. In the process of lighting up all the different areas in the brain, a number of natural chemicals start being produced in greater quantities. The chemicals that we all know the name of: dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. So more of these chemicals start being produced. That's why music works as medicine. It's not complicated. Mm-hmm. In the book, there's a wonderful music therapist named Dr. Connie Tomeno, who I went to college with, actually, and she figures in several places in the book. Mm-hmm. And I remember I hadn't seen her since our college years, and we had a wonderful reunion where I went up to her office up in the Bronx at Montefiore Hospital. And I don't know. I'm sorry. She's not at Montefiore. That's something else. It was the hospital she was in at the Bronx at the time. And I met with her, and she gave the best layman's explanation I've ever heard of how the music saved my life. She said, those chemicals were produced in abundance in my brain that flowed through my body, carrying a message. And the message was, it's not time to shut down yet. Isn't that wonderful? Mm-hmm. So, all during this time on this Zoom right now, what we're hearing in different ways that that music is a very, very powerful medical modality.
Yeah, there's also another aspect of it that physicists call entrainment, that you mention in the book about entrainment is the tendency of two oscillating bodies to lock into phase so they vibrate in sympathetic harmony. Our internal rhythms, heart rate and respiration rate, will speed up or slow down to match a stronger external rhythm, such as waves lapping a beach or speeding traffic, or the incessant pulsing noise of machines and television and talking in a SICU. Most patients' vital signs are higher than normal in such an environment. Music can reach out to a patient to get in sync and balance any disharmony.
Yes.
Yeah, which is what you did with Alice. But I want to allow a little time for questions. Anybody have a question?
Yes, I do have a question for
Okay.
Andrew. Do you have like a CD of your music?
Oh,
Yes, I have. CDs on the Centaur label, Centaur, and you can go to Amazon and get them.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Beautiful music. I love guitar. That's my favorite instrument.
Oh, thank you.
yes, me too. And I would love to play that Scott Joplin piece if we have time, but we'll see. Kara has a question. Let's see, what was the question? Where can you see the documentary? Yeah, where can the documentary film be accessed? It's I can send you the link.
Yeah, there's a link you can
Vimeo.
send her. Yeah, that Vimeo, and that's a password, so you need to
I have
send
the
that to her.
password. I'll send you the link and the password.
I know that Josh Aronson, through his company, if you just Google Josh Aronson, Aronson, Josh Aronson, Google him and filmmaker. He has a website, and he sells the DVD for the film.
Oh, okay.
I don't think you can find it online other than the password protected.
It should be on YouTube.
Yeah, I don't think he's put it up on YouTube. He should put it up. He should put it up at this point.
I think it should. It's only 30 minutes long, and it's just delightful. I really liked it. I watched it a couple of times.
Kalandra had a question?
Kalandra have a question?
I do have a question. I wanted to know, hi Andrew, by the way.
Hi Kalandra.
I wanted to know what's next, and also if there are things that we can do to help support this effort.
Well, the Medical Musician Initiative has a website. It's medicalmusicianinitiative.org, and you can go there, and as all these nonprofit organizations, we can always be helped by, first of all, donations to help keep us going. You asked what's next. So I became, in March 2020, I became the visiting artist at the Arts and Humanities Program at Georgetown University Medical Center in Washington, D.C. And I was going to be going down there regularly to play in the ICUs and to train people. And of course, that's the beginning of the pandemic. So I haven't been able to do that. However, fortunately, the reason that they reached out to me to bring me on board with them is they were in the planning stages then for a new study of ICU music. They wound up getting a very big National Endowment of the Arts grant for that, and they asked me to be the musician for the study. And the project manager for the study is a woman named Julia Langley. The study is actually about to start very soon, within a month or so. And I asked her if she would write out for me a simple thing that I could read on this about the study. And I'll do that right now. The study is called Recovery in the ICU, an investigation of music-induced physiologic changes that promote healing. The goal is to better understand how music promotes healing. The study subjects will be Georgetown University Hospital liver transplant patients. The hospital has one of the largest and most successful transplant programs in the country. Now, for the study, my involvement was that I selected, arranged, and recorded 3 sets of music which will be played for patients for 2 days while they recover in the ICU. The music sets will be played in the morning, at noon, and in the evening. As the music is played, patients will be monitored for vital signs including heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen level. The researchers will also measure changes in skin temperature and cortisol levels. The study is about how music engages the whole body, not just the auditory system, to better understand how it can help people feel better, heal better, and improve health care through the arts. So that was from Julia Langley. Now, the chief investigator for the study is a neuroscientist by the name of Jagmeet Kanwal, PhD. And he wrote out the following. He hypothesizes that music has a synergistic effect via pressure receptors in the ear, skin, and internal organs. He says, in effect, the whole body can function as a sound receiver. Think of music as a pattern of pressure waves, not just frequencies. Though seemingly imperceptible to us when we listen to soft music, the subtle stimulation of pressure receptors under the skin may energize the brain's autonomic system. In turn, hormonal balance as well as respiratory and heart rates may shift. These physiologic changes could initiate recovery and healing. So this study is going to start in about a month. It'll take about 2 months to do it, and by the end of December they start collecting all the data, and then they will be publishing the results. Now, at this point, we just have fingers crossed that it's going to be, we're going to see what we hope it's going to show, and that's how it goes with studies. You know, you have to do it and then see how it turns out. So in terms of what's next, that's what my involvement is right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I would just add that I looked at a lot of the research literature in recent years on music for ICU patients, and there has not been another study exactly like this one done. So it's breaking some new ground.
Great.
Yeah, what I've heard is that it is because of the technology that they're using and because of the way Conwall has designed it. It's supposed to be pretty groundbreaking.
That's great. There's a question from Sharon in the chat. Can you clarify why you use the term medical musician and not therapeutic music? I also know from other training that there is a difference between therapeutic music and music therapy.
Yeah. I came up with the term medical musician, and I talk about this in the book. Mm-hmm. When I started doing this in the first few months, the director of the music therapy program, who we saw in the film, Dr. Joanne Lowy, got very excited one day and said she thought I was a natural at doing this, and would I like to become a music therapist? Well, at that time I was 57 years old. I was working full-time as a musician, and in order to become a music therapist, I'd have to go back to a 4-year college program. And so it was absolutely not going to happen.
Yeah.
And I had this thought about what would I call myself at that point, and the term medical musician just popped into my head, because a medical musician, as we define it, is a professional musician who's had pertinent training in critical care medicine and becomes the member of the medical team in an ICU. Mm-hmm. So that's the background. Now, as it turns out, the idea of musical medicine is ancient. The first recorded examples of a discussion and the use of music as medicine goes all the way back to Pythagoras, the Greek philosopher and mathematician who was also one of the finest musicians in Greece in his day, and he founded a school of which he called it musical medicine. So calling it medical music is essentially the same thing, and that's why I call it medical musician. As Jenzi pointed out earlier, there are other methods and approaches to doing this besides music therapy. We're just one of them. The thing about MMI, the medical musician concept that we have, is it's the only one of them that's specifically dedicated to critical care medicine. That's how I use the term. A medical musician focuses on critical care.
Great. Well, if there's one last short question, otherwise we're kind of out of time, but I'm going to, does anyone have any more questions? I want to thank you, Andrew, and I'm going to play the Scott Joplin piece as just an ending to this wonderful dialogue.
Well, Gloria, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I really appreciate it. And it's so nice to spend these couple of hours with all of you. I'm really very grateful.
Thank you.
This has been great. Thank you, Andrew and Gloria. And the other members of my family say thanks too.
Great.
Thank you.
And Sharon is saying, I look forward to reading your book. So.
Oh, thank you, Sharon.
Okay, here's Andrew Schulman playing Scott Joplin, who, if you're not familiar with Scott Joplin, he wrote a lot of ragtime music. So this is a short piece by Scott Joplin called, what's the name of it, Andrew, again?
Sunflower Slow Drag.
Sunflower Slow Drag.
Thank you.
Thank you. Here we go. Good night, everybody.
Good night, Gloria. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so
Bye,
much,
Calandra.
Andrew.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you.
You.